Right, everyone. Right, Judy, see if make a start and see what happens.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you don't hear me. Welcome back. Sorry, Martin's doing various things.
Can you hear Judy?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Right.
I finished in mid-sentence there because I wasn't sure that you could hear me.
No, all good, Judy. All good.
Right.
Right. So welcome back, everybody. Lovely to see you and hear some of you again. And I hope you've had a good summer, as good as it can be in the present circumstances. And we're starting with something that I hope you're going to enjoy, which is George IV before he became George IV, and even before he became regent, which was in.
Can I interrupt you a second, Judy? Can you just stand up a second? I can't get full picture up there a minute. What do I need, Jonathan, to get full picture of Judy?
You need to go into view and go into speaker.
Right, got that. Got a picture of you, beautiful as you are. I'd rather have Judy.
Yeah. As soon as you start speaking and I stop, you should get it.
Right, you stop and I'll start. Right, let's see what we get. No, we're not getting it. I've just got a little one up there.
There's something called full screen. You should be able to get it when you do that.
Oh, there we are. Exit full screen.
Right, it says full screen at the moment, but it's you.
We can get you, Martin, and we could get Judy.
What, full screen?
Yes.
Okay, in which case I shall give Judy back her seat, let her carry on.
So just I won't see me.
You won't see you, that's right.
Which is good. Which is good. That is good. I'm much happier with that. Oh, can I move a bit further?
You can. Right in.
I think so.
We can see you, Judy.
Yeah, that's good.
It's
Do I
good.
look enormous? Because I'm
No.
quite near now. Do I look all right? Because I can't see me now, which is good. This is excellent.
I'll get you
I
some water.
don't like seeing me. So
Oh,
this is much better.
behave.
So welcome, everybody. Welcome back. And thank you for your loyalty. So what I was trying to say, it was all getting a bit complicated with technology. This is an easy way in to the period known as the Regency, although this is pre-Regency, Jane Austen time. So we're talking about George, Prince of Wales, later the Regent, and later still King George IV, one of the most unpopular kings we have ever experienced in this country. Really awful, even more awful than King John. Not because he was cruel, but he appeared to be indifferent to the sufferings of his people. So what we're going to look at today really is his early life and a kind of psychological insight into why he became awful when he'd had such an encouraging start and when people had admired him and thought that he showed enormous promise and they were really looking forward to him becoming their ruler, their monarch. So we're going to look really at what went wrong, because he is notorious for selfishness, a disinclination to concern himself with the sufferings of his people. We'll go into that later. Why were they suffering? You're probably thinking. Well, we'll talk about that later. And nowadays, of course, historians do quite a lot of investigating famous people's past life or past experiences, their parents and so on, their upbringing, because that's a modern way of looking at things, to sort of do a bit of a psychological, try and get a psychological insight into somebody's character and personality and their actions. Why do they behave as they do? Is it something to do with their childhood? And often, of course, it is. We are formed by our early experiences. So in the case of George, Prince of Wales, which is he is in this particular talk, he is the Prince of Wales, long before he became the regent. He was born in 1762, and immediately people started to admire this lovely, big, healthy, strong baby, the firstborn. Born very soon after their marriage, only 9 months really after the marriage. King George III absolutely delighted that his wife was what he called rather elegantly fruitful. He'd been quite concerned about this because he lacked self-esteem and was always very nervous about doing things correctly, and he'd worried about letting the country down, marrying somebody who might not be fruitful. But nothing to worry about. She got pregnant straight away, and obviously the country was hoping that it would be a son. The succession would be definite, and that they would be able to look forward to the future with confidence. That they would be, and then of course she had another baby within a year, so there was an heir and a spare, and they were sort of brought up together. And everybody thought what a beautiful baby this was. So he got lots of praise and admiration right from the word go. And a very attractive child. And Martin found some lovely pictures. The miniature, which you'd see, where he's wearing the red coat and the black hat at a jaunty angle. That one's famous because it shows what a very attractive young man he was, with the typical Hanoverian looks. Very fresh, lovely skin, fresh complexion, fair hair, big blue eyes, very attractive looking. And then Martin found the other picture, which is famous, painted quite a bit later, where his hair's gone a bit darker, and King George, before he went to sea, he did go to sea rather dramatically, and we will come to that. He went off physically and in terms of temperament. So we need to look at why. His early upbringing was idyllic. Not only did he receive a lot of praise and encouragement, he was very fortunate in that his mother, Queen Charlotte, undertook his education. She was a very well-read, intellectual person, although she'd had to subsume her intellectual interests when she became queen, because she was very concerned about, her whole life really was devoted to supporting and encouraging her rather timid, frightened husband. And she gave up a lot of her interests in favor of her husband. She doesn't get much credit for that. But in terms of education, she certainly believed in the importance of education, a well-rounded education. And she also believed that education should be an enjoyable experience for the young. And both she and her husband, King George, accepted the ideas, of very, very new, radical ideas of Rousseau, who'd written a book called Emile, a fiction, a child of fiction. And it was a sort of textbook about how to raise a child, how to educate a child, giving them a good education, but keeping them happy. So very much diet, which is a modern idea, very modern. So they were way ahead of that. Rousseau was way ahead of his time. A simple, healthy diet, lots of fresh food, early bedtimes, lots of exercise. Very important when raising sons, lots of exercise. Fresh air and appreciation of nature. Again, it's very modern. It's sort of many, many years ahead of his time, Rousseau. Amazingly ahead of his time. And also learning to play, learning through play, which is Montessori and Freudal ideas. That children learn better when they're happy and they're discovering things through something enjoyable. And Rousseau claimed that this worked very well, that this system worked very well. It wasn't an indulgent system. Children learned better than they had done being stuck in a classroom or a study, just being filled with information by stern tutors. Just the empty vessel way of educating. The children are empty vessels, the teacher is the jug full of water, and you just keep pouring more and more information into the children, and they absorb the information and come back for more, which we know very well doesn't always work. So the young princes had the benefit of this very enlightened form of education. They had the benefit of lots of fresh air, healthy meals, and learning through play. They also had the benefit of a father who loved small children, genuinely loved small children, and therefore played with his children, which was regarded in those days as again, really quite radical, very unusual, that he showed his children affection quite openly, and praised them and played with them, and we could call it an idyllic childhood. Lots of affection shown, not so much by the mother. She had turned a little bit sort of diffident when it came to showing emotions. She decided when she came from Germany that she was going to follow whatever she found was current in England, learn to behave as the English did, and that they were a little bit buttoned up, and so she followed the lead of the people she saw around her. That you didn't show very much emotion, and you stayed dignified at all times. So she found her husband's uninhibited behaviour almost embarrassing, and she didn't copy it. She was the one who checked on the prince's lessons, made sure that they were learning, and came over a little bit stiff and severe, but they had this lovely dad, really, who was like a modern father, sort of being very involved in the children's development and education, praising them and playing. So how do things go wrong? Well, they certainly didn't go wrong straight away. The other lovely thing that happened to the princes was that they had a wonderful governess called Lady Charlotte Finch, who was a friend of the royal family. She was ideal for the job, very intelligent, widely read, widely travelled, spoke many languages, and was a committed Christian, which is really why the royal family had selected her. She had a very strong sense of moral purpose without being pompous or bigoted. Greatly admired by Queen Charlotte. So Queen Charlotte had been instrumental in inviting this lady to become the governess for the royal, for the princes. And she thought that her charges were lovely. So she was very happy to praise them and encourage them, again, in a very positive way. not very much criticism, only when they did something really wrong. Light on punishments, just using a sort of modern system of saying, you know, I'm really disappointed in the way you just behaved, and this is the way you should have behaved. Encouragement rather than savage punishments. And she talked about her dear little princes, that was Prince George and Prince Frederick, the Duke of York. And she was very proud of the fact that Prince George showed such promise, that he was a very, very polite child. He read very early and he wrote very well and had lovely manners. And she described him as a kind and thoughtful child. So it's all going really well, all going in a very positive direction. So again, we say, what on earth went wrong? How did he turn into this awful, selfish, self-admiring character with all the sort of dreadful cartoons? And we'll come to that later. Some of the most awful political cartoons when he became the regent, or even before that, when he was Prince of Wales. Savage cartoons mocking every aspect of his personality and his behaviour. How did it all go so horribly wrong? Keep asking ourselves. And he'd had this really perfect, idyllic childhood. One problem was that the boys, like modern royalty, were on show a great deal. The parents tried to protect them and tried to shelter them, but the fact remained that they were on show a great deal. But again, they received nothing but praise, particularly Prince George, who of course was the centre of attention, the future king. Lady Mary Cook, it's spelt Coke, but pronounced Cook. Speaking of the prince, when he was 6 years old, I see no fault in the Prince of Wales, thinking him one of the finest boys I know. And she was full of praise and admiration, and she wasn't just sucking up to the royal family. It was a genuinely held opinion that he was a most attractive child in every possible way, in every respect. He was charming, got these beautiful manners, he knew how to behave. Everybody saying how mature he was, what a delight he was when he was speaking to adults. Somebody once said he was like talking to an adult because he had been trained with these beautiful, elegant manners and never put a foot wrong. And one of the problems that modern psychologists would be pinpointing during this idyllic period in his life was that his mother, Queen Charlotte, became increasingly unhappy. We all know that she eventually gave birth to 15 children, which is somewhat of a record in terms of royal births. And we know what she felt. She didn't express her feelings so much in this country. As we said, she'd learned to be quite inhibited and buttoned up and stiff up her lip, etc. But she poured her heart out to her brother, and the letters have survived. So we do know what she really felt about life. And she had learned to submit to her husband, his strange whims and wishes, and she decided that she was going to suppress her own likes, dislikes, and wishes, and do what was right for the country. So she was motivated by a sense of duty, which has gone down in the royal family very strongly, the sense of duty. And this was a driving sense. This driving sense of duty dominated her life. As a result, because she was having to rein in her own desires, her own preferences, she became very severe and uncompromising, and in a way took it out on her children because she was frustrated in many ways. not being able to do what she wanted, but particularly borne down by year in, year out being pregnant. And she actually wrote very feelingly, I don't think a prisoner could wish more ardently for his liberty than I wish to be rid of my burden upon and see the end of my campaign. And she saw childbearing, excuse me, as a campaign. It's interesting. As something you've got to do and be brave about, as though you're in the army. And soldiers mustn't complain, they must do as they're told, they must be obedient, but that the campaign will eventually be over. A campaign, not a war. So it's interesting, she chose the word campaign. She wanted it to end. She didn't want to keep on having children every year. But the king, and again, this might be an aspect of his later madness, absolutely adored children. You know, he wanted lots and lots more children. And he wanted twins. He was very anxious that somewhere along the line they should have twins. Almost as though he saw his wife as a kind of machine that was just going to keep on churning out children without any real thought of what it was doing to her in terms of health, and that she, you know, maybe she liked some other life apart from being pregnant all the time. So it's interesting that she uses the word campaign because she wanted to see the end of this campaign. And she said that in 1780 and had 2 more children after that. So she doesn't come over historically as a very attractive character, poor Queen Charlotte. She didn't come over very well at all. But when you look into the longing she had to stop having all these babies, and yet she doggedly went on having them, start to feel a degree of sympathy for her. She was very puritanical, and probably had been when she lived in Germany. And this annoyed the prince as he got older, and his mother's opinions became more apparent. Holding the children in check was very much the order of the day, telling them how to behave. They wanted their children, both she and the king, wanted their children to be sort of clones of the parents. They wanted them to be exactly like they were and have the same attitudes and the same opinions, the same approach to life. But as we can see, that all went horribly wrong. So what went really wrong? Can we sort of look again psychologically at something that was damaging? Well, one of the things that was damaging was that when the boys were 9 years old, or when George was 9 years old, it was decided, again, the parents decided that it was time to almost graduate to grown-up education. And they no longer needed to have the governess that she had perhaps kept them a little bit young and perhaps praised them a little bit too much. And it was decided that the king would now supervise their education, not the queen. He would take over. And because he lacked judgment in many ways, George III did lack judgment and was very stubborn, and it was difficult to get him to change his mind, and it was difficult for him to take advice, which he saw as criticism, as a lot of us do. A lot of us find it hard to take criticism unless it's handled in a very tactful way. But because the king had always lacked self-esteem because of his background, being criticised by his mother and told he was a bit useless, he tended to stick, once he made his mind up about something, he thought that it was a very adult and mature thing to do, was to stick to stick to what you'd said, stick to your guns, keep your opinion, don't waver, don't don't give in to anybody else's opinions. That was a mature and an attractive characteristic, and showed that you were a strong person. Because back of his mind all the time, he was probably remembering how he'd been criticised for being timid and weak, and it found it very hard to make his mind up about things when he was young. So George III had this, again, we're looking at a psychological trait of being very stubborn as an adult. So it was his idea that they should know that the princes, the two older ones anyway, should now have an adult kind of education. No more nice, kind governess. So tutors were brought in. The boys were given their own establishments with their own household, probably when they were too young. And the royal couple began to admonish their sons, particularly George, giving him lots of advice which he wasn't ready to take. Abhor all vice in private as in public, look upon yourselves, well, that was plural, that was the two boys, as obliged to set a good example. Disdain all flattery, it will corrupt your manners and render you contemptible before the world. There's only so much of that children can cope with, you know, constantly being told how to behave. The implication being you're not delivering, you're not behaving in the right way. So instead of being praised for their lovely manners, they were now being criticised for not having the right attitudes, for being just children. They were being expected to be adults. So that would have a damaging effect. They were beginning to suffer in the same way as George III had suffered. They were being criticised and feeling that they weren't matching up to the demands of the adults. Also, the tutors were very strict. It was a very grown-up kind of education, and it was very sudden. You know, they lost their lovely kind governess, who had taught them a great deal, but in a very kindly way. And now it was the opposite. They'd got lots of different tutors, which they were having to get used to, and the tutors were encouraged to be very strict and uncompromising. If the princes didn't do something, then they were to be punished, and they were to be punished by being whipped. So rather a sudden contrast at the age of 9. The king, being very anxious, an anxious kind of person, was micromanaging his sons' lives, even to the point of deciding what they should eat. Now, they had been brought up, the Rousseau idea was that they should have simple, fresh food, nothing fancy, not kind of grown-up food with lots of fancy sauces, etc. But George III, who had a fetish about food, he was terrified of putting weight on, because the Hanoverians all had this gene where they tended to put weight on. George III was very, very abstemious and in food and drink. So he micromanaged their diet. So as the boys grew up and should have been exposed to perhaps being allowed to have something a little bit more exotic in their diet, we read that they were given virtually nursery food. And it's interesting that this tradition continued. It's exactly the same with Queen Victoria. She had nursery food, very, very simple food, until she became queen at the age of 18, and was sort of then going to banquets where there was all sorts of, you know, lobster and all sorts of, well, not fancy, but more exotic food than she'd had before. It became a tradition. So, an example, this is the king, the actual king saying this, they may have the fruit of the tart without the crust. 1 glass of wine only after dinner. And I've written a recipe for rebellion, that these boys were growing up and they would start asking, you know, why can't we be like other people? Why can't we have more? Why can't we have wine during the meal as other people did? The answer was no. The father doesn't approve of it. So by the age of 18, so what would now be coming of age, what was George like? Well, we've got a lot of descriptions of him. What was George Prince of Wales like? Very physically attractive, handsome, tall, and we said fresh complexion, the blonde hair, the big blue eyes, beautiful manners, well read. He learned to dance very, very beautifully, and he could play the piano and the cello very well indeed. Very accomplished young man. Foreign observers raved about him. They found him most impressive, but the psychological damage that was being done was that his father had kept up a constant litany of criticism, constantly criticizing his son, accusing him of being ungrateful for all the benefits he'd received, that he was he liked drink too much, he was lazy, constantly saying he was lazy, which he was. But you don't make people unlazy by telling them all the time that they're bad for being lazy. That doesn't work. Encouragement is needed, something a bit more subtle. Well, George III was never subtle, and he didn't have very good judgment. He just went on for the battering away at his son with all this criticism, thinking that at some point his son would completely change, listen to his father and do everything his father said. And to be fair, mother as well. So son was lazy and didn't understand his duties as heir to the throne. He wasn't sufficiently diligent, and he did have a point when it came to money. George Prince of Wales seemed to have something missing in his mind when it came to money. He just didn't understand how money worked. He just thought, I mean, you know, we laugh about saying money doesn't grow on trees. Well, he seemed to think it did. Or there was somewhere in his various residences that was producing money, because he never understood that money was finite. He had the idea that money just kept on appearing because he was the Prince of Wales, and therefore there was always money around. There was always plenty of everything around. He never learned the value of money or possessions. Well, he learned the value of possessions. He just wanted more and more, but he didn't seem to understand that they cost money. Money was infinite as far as he was concerned. And of course, his family, his parents, who'd been very abstemious and puritanical, were very concerned about this aspect of his personality. And the more his diet and his drinking was controlled, the more he wanted fancy food and lots of wine, and that became an issue. But what they were particularly worried about was, once he got his own establishment and more freedom, which was good, he began to show a very, very strong interest in the opposite sex. They found this very, very worrying indeed. George III, possibly remembering how many times he'd fallen in love before he was married off to Princess Charlotte, to keep him out of any further mischief. Not that he consummated any of these relationships, but he had fallen very passionately in love. That was in the prince's genes. The idea that he found the opposite sex very attractive. So his parents, you know, flew into a kind of frenzy of concern about this aspect of their son's nature. And the father and son's relationship deteriorated and never recovered. There's just this litany of criticism from George III and resentment on the part of his son and heir, to the point where the son and heir once said, very feelingly to friends, "My father hates me. He always did from 7 years old." And that is a really sad thing for a young man to feel. And again, we can see psychologically he was damaged by this constant criticism, no encouragement, no praise. And psychologists today, child psychologists, talk about consistency, how important consistency is in a child's upbringing. And this is something that the princes George and Frederick didn't have. They'd had this lovely idyllic childhood and lots of praise and encouragement. And then suddenly this change, very dramatic change, to lots of hard work, punishments, actually really, really savage punishments. The tutors encouraged to hit these boys if they didn't do as they were told. Very much sort of public school kind of upbringing by that time. And that in itself was damaging. Trying to, the two princes trying to adjust to their new life and hating it. Very, very bad psychologically to come to reach some sort of mental adjustment to the change. Children who have a change in circumstances often blame themselves. What have I done wrong that this has happened? I mean, we don't know that that's how they thought, but this is a possibility that they were thinking at first anyway. Why is everything so different? Have we done something wrong? And then as the criticism continued, yes, they begin to think, yes, we are wrong. And then resisting and rebelling against it. No, we haven't done anything wrong. Our parents who are wrong. Why are they being so horrible to us all the time? So, this is very much like Queen Victoria and Bertie, later Edward VII. Mishandling of an intelligent young man. Mishandling by a stream of criticism instead of praise and encouragement. And the child turns into the exact opposite of what the parents are hoping for. Absolutely opposite. They go against what the parents have been preaching. And it is like preaching, constantly criticizing, constantly saying, you should be like this. And the child thinking, I am not going to be like that. I'm going to do the exact, I'm going to be free to do what I want. And doing it in a very dramatic way. Not just a little bit of rebellion, like modern children saying, well, parents say I've got to be home at 10, I'm going to stay out a bit longer and risk getting into trouble. I want to stay with my mate, you know, I want to stay out till midnight, then I'll get into trouble. Little rebellions. Because of the harshness of the criticism, the rebellion is huge. So, King George III and Queen Charlotte found to their horror that the things they'd been dreading were actually happening, that their son, particularly George, was turning into all the things that they had been so afraid of. Totally self-indulgent, dissipated, extravagant, theatrical, pleased with himself, very pleased with himself, praising himself instead of getting praise from other people. That's again a behavior which can be predicted by psychologists. If you don't get any praise, then you praise yourself, or you turn to some sort of behavior which is comforting, like drink or drugs. So there is a possibility again that George III was very jealous of his son because of all his attractive characteristics, that George III himself had been a very awkward, shy, intellectually struggling teenager, very low in self-confidence and self-esteem. And subconsciously, he was probably quite jealous of his son, who had all the attributes that he lacked. And his son had self-belief in spades. He was full of himself because of all the praise he'd had. You could say he'd had far too much praise when he was little, and so he had become arrogant and conceited. And the father then became more and more critical of him because subconsciously he was jealous. So we have marriage now, the problems of George IV, the Prince of Wales, going into a life of dissipation and making very, very poor judgments, which again he may have inherited from his father. Lack of judgment, being unable to make good judgments. We know that the Prince of Wales met Maria Fitzherbert via some friends, as people often do meet each other because of friends, mutual friends. She'd been widowed twice, she was a Catholic, and she was 6 years older than the Prince. Comfortably provided for, handsome rather than beautiful, with a fine figure. Everyone admired her eyes. They said she got lovely eyes, and she got fair hair and good skin. People were very particular to describe these things in those days. You find that in Jane Austen's books. Very, very detailed descriptions of people. She was, in personality, kind, patient, confident, and outwardly calm. He was 22 years old. The Prince was 22 years old. He'd had several affairs by this time and was getting a reputation for being promiscuous. And Maria behaved rather like Anne Boleyn with Henry VIII. To the Prince's surprise, she refused to sleep with him. She wouldn't become his lover or his mistress. She had high principles. She was a very moral lady. Well, it worked the same way as worked with Henry VIII. The fact of refusal made her seem even more attractive, and the Prince started to behave in a really peculiar way, determined to make her change her mind. He quickly realised that she was adamant about not becoming his mistress, so he decided he was going to propose to her, and she still refused. In fact, she found the Prince's behaviour really quite embarrassing, because by this time he had become very theatrical in his behaviour, partly because of some of the books he'd read, and a lot of people would see to us nowadays to be very, very over the top in the things they said and wrote. But the Prince really set a standard in being completely theatrical and making a fool of himself. Rolling about on the floor, making shrieking noises, tearing his hair out, thumping his chest, I haven't put that, but thumping his chest, saying he was going to die of love, weeping, writing letters several times a day, 40-page letters sometimes. Just again, there's almost a balance on the madness here. So people have suggested that he was as mad as his father, and that he'd inherited this gene that he was completely over the top when it came to love. He behaved like this on several other occasions. Refused to eat, said he was going to sort of starve himself to death unless she agreed to marry him. And finally stabbing himself. He didn't, it was a rather half-hearted attempt, but he did actually draw blood, and it frightened everybody. Of course, his entourage were very frightened that he said he was going to kill himself, and they thought, well, what are we going to do? We can't just sort of stand here or sit here watching him carry out this threat. Mrs. Fitzherbert, Maria Fitzherbert, panicked and went to France. I mean, really, she found the whole thing deeply embarrassing, the fact that she'd become centre stage. And he kept saying that if she didn't marry him, he would definitely kill himself next time. And talking about her as his dearest beloved wife. So she came back from France and agreed to meet him, and he became absolutely hysterical and said he would renounce his title. He would live anywhere, including America, if only she would consent to marry him. And so the poor woman agreed, fearing for his life, fearing that he was so intemperate and so dramatic that he probably would kill himself. So she agreed. And in 1785, they were married in secret. And of course, it was an illegal marriage in two ways. First of all, she was a Catholic. And by the Act of Settlement, British royalty are not allowed to, if they do marry a Catholic, they lose their place in the succession. Or the person they want to marry, who is a Catholic, must convert to becoming Anglican, to make the marriage valid. Well, her religion meant a huge amount to her, so there was no way she was going to become an Anglican. And the second way in which the marriage was invalid was that by the Royal Marriages Act, as we've already spoken about, the king's permission had to be given, and that's still true today. The Queen has to give her permission for members of the royal family to get married. And obviously, they didn't ask permission. So it was invalidated in two ways. It was a totally invalid marriage. Martin's found quite a lot about Maria Fitzherbert. There are all sorts of rumours about her, all sorts of stories, many of them scandalous. She remained calm and dignified throughout all this. Eventually, as people had predicted, he abandoned her. He couldn't stay faithful to anybody for very long because by this time he had become promiscuous. He bought houses for her. They never actually lived together as a married couple. He bought houses for her so that she was always near his royal residences. For example, after he built the pavilion in Brighton, his massive error of judgment, this vast building, he got some massive into debt, millions and millions and millions of pounds into debt. He arranged for her to have a home near Brighton Pavilion so that he could visit her. But they were never a couple, although they were seen in public together. They never lived together. And quite quickly they started to argue about his affairs, his heavy drinking, his ridiculous and reckless spending, and his lies and dishonesty. Maria Fitzherbert was a moral woman. She'd only agreed to have this connection with the prince because he'd married her. But by this time, his personality had deteriorated very considerably, and she found that very, very difficult to accept. And by 1794, he'd met somebody called Lady Jersey and fallen madly in love with her and gone through the same palaver with her, throwing himself on the ground, rolling about, screaming and shouting and saying, I love you, I'm going to die if you don't become my mistress. She gave in quite quickly, actually. She could see the advantages of being the prince's mistress, that she was on the make, unlike Maria Fitzherbert, who just come out of this relationship in a very dignified way, has to be said. So they then part company and Maria Fitzherbert is pensioned off. But then we come to the official marriage. By this time, the prince's debts are enormous. They are astronomical. And his father has paid his debts on several occasions, but now they have become quite ridiculous. And Parliament, the second port of call, the prince would go to Parliament and say, will you pay off my debts? And Parliament are usually obliged after debates and criticism and so on, that they usually finally conceded that it wasn't right for the heir to the throne to be so much in debt, and they'd paid the debt off. But this time they dug their toes in and said, no, we will only pay your debts if you do something that's good for the country. Like get married to somebody appropriate and produce children so that the succession is assured. And to be fair, the prince decided straight away that was what he was going to do. The strange thing is that he didn't do any homework. He'd always said he didn't want an arranged marriage. He wanted to choose his own partner. He said it on several occasions. But weirdly, on this occasion, he decided, again, the lack of judgment and the lack of forethought does suggest that there was something he'd inherited that was not quite right. A lot of people have said that he showed signs of mental instability at quite an early age. Never went mad, or never technically described as mad, but there are all sorts of indications that he didn't think straight. He didn't do any homework on the person that he chose. And the person he chose was a cousin, a first cousin called Caroline of Brunswick. His sister Augusta had gone to Germany and married into the Brunswick family. So he seemed to think that because he got on well with his sister Augusta, her child would be just like her, and therefore she'd be a good marriage partner. He didn't do any background, he didn't do any searching or finding out or anything. So you might say, well, what happened served him right. So without any real investigation or research being done, the next thing anybody knew was that Caroline of Brunswick was the one. She was going to be the queen, the future queen of England. And Lord Malmesbury, one of the king's friends, was sent to collect her. Because they were hastening the marriage, because the prince was so anxious to have his debts dealt with by Parliament. And Parliament was saying, well, we'll wait until you're married. So you've sorted yourself out, till you've settled down and become a married man and started to behave yourself, then we'll pay your debts. So Lord Malmesbury went to escort Caroline, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, back to this country, and was immediately shocked at what he discovered. That she was really very inappropriate. She wasn't suitable at all. And he did his very best, poor man, to explain to her what life in England would be like and what would be expected of her. And what would be expected of her was not to behave as she was behaving when he first met her. He tried very hard to calm her down and to explain that some of the things she said and did would not go down at all well in the English court or the British court. And she appeared to listen. She appeared to be, I mean, she didn't get angry and resentful, which he saw as a plus point, that she listened quite patiently to his advice, and he felt that he was making some headway. But in fact, she was listening politely, but she had no intention of, or was incapable of following the advice. So he was thinking that he was doing rather a good job on this wild young woman who didn't seem to have had any proper training at all in how to behave in public, whereas in fact, she was just being good-natured. And he finally said, you know, one of the nice, he was sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel, trying to think of something good to say about her. A bit like teachers trying to think of something good to say about a really difficult pupil. And he kept saying, she has a good nature. She has a good nature. And she's not moody, and she's not bad-tempered, and she listens to my advice with great patience. But it was a bit of a smokescreen because she just paid no attention to it. And she appeared to be listening eagerly and agreeing and saying, yes, I will. When we get to England, yes, I'll do all these things. But in fact, she didn't. So what was wrong with her? Well, what was wrong with her? There were lots of things wrong. First of all, personal hygiene. She didn't change her underclothes. Personal hygiene was poor. She didn't like getting washed. And so she was actually smelly on occasion. She was smelly. Poor Lord Malmesbury found this so difficult, you can imagine, so difficult a subject to approach, but he did. He bit the bullet and he approached the subject and tried to reason with her. She spoke loudly. She was loud, and she interrupted people. She told smutty jokes. Poor Lord Malmesbury again found this awfully difficult to deal with. He never met a woman who told naughty jokes and laughed at other people's jokes. She actually listened to men telling jokes and either joined in or laughed immoderately loudly, which meant that she understood the joke, which was very, very shocking in those days. That women weren't supposed to understand things like that at all. They were supposed to be modest and keep their heads down and pretend that they didn't understand. And if they overheard a joke, they had to pretend they didn't understand it at all. Even if they did, they had to pretend. But usually they wouldn't have understood the joke because they had been brought up as young ladies, and young ladies didn't even have the facts of life explained to them. So this behaviour was absolutely bewildering for poor Monsbury. Imagine the poor man so struggling with this. I've got to sort this young woman out before we get back to England. She repeated gossip. She was very, very indiscreet. She heard things. She heard the servants talking, and repeated what she'd heard, and laughed about it instead of being discreet and careful and minding people, being aware of people's feelings. That seemed to be absolutely. She just couldn't compute that at all. Other people's feelings just didn't seem to matter. She was boisterous. She was restless. Overblown in every way. She dressed badly. She was blousy and slightly overweight, bad choice in clothes, light and flighty mind. Lord St. Monsbury finally described her. She had a light and flighty mind. She was wasn't, to use the old word that I was brought up with, as a lot of you will have known, common. Considering that she was royal, she was common. How had this happened? Well, her parents basically had neglected her. They couldn't be bothered with her. They weren't very interested in children. She'd been brought up with companions and governesses and tutors that didn't really have very high standards. And she was a neglected child. So she'd been brought up badly, basically. She was a totally inappropriate consort for the Prince of Wales, who by this time had the title, the first gentleman of Europe, because of his exquisite manners. He was a role model for people in other countries to model themselves on, to be like the English, the British Prince of Wales. He had perfect manners, perfect decorum, and therefore people called him the first gentleman of Europe. In clothes, in knowing about antiques, in knowledge of music and painting and so on. He was exceptional. And so this young lady was not going to be a suitable consort. So poor Earl of Malmesbury sort of expressed his fears and his doubts on the voyage back to his country, on the journey, the long journey where he was in a carriage with this rather smelly young lady, being very boisterous and telling him dirty jokes. I mean, it was a nightmare, the poor man. What an ordeal. Anyway, famously, when the prince met his future bride for the first time, famously, he took one look at her and then said, "Harris," that was Malmesbury, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." So doesn't betoken well for the harmony and love that the married couple was supposed to have for one another, the experience in their partnership. It doesn't sound too good. She reported her disappointment, typically the very outspoken way. He's not as handsome as his portrait, and he's much fatter than I expected. Totally outspoken, totally, no restraint shown. That was the problem with her. She had no self-restraint. The wedding took place, absolute nightmare. The wedding night, he was during the wedding, he had to be supported. He drunk so much brandy, he had to be sort of held up by the courtiers, his valet and his entourage had to kind of hold him up. The wedding night, again famously, she reported that he consummated the marriage and then fell into the fireplace, absolutely blind drunk. And there, she said, he remained throughout the night. He stayed in the fireplace, drunk. So drunk he didn't even realise he was in the fireplace, he didn't wake up. As a result, he only slept with her 3 nights. that's what she said. Some people thought she exaggerated, but he was just determined to get her with child, and then that was going to be it. She conceived immediately. 9 months later, she gave birth to Princess Charlotte, the heir to the throne. And straight away, the prince, as soon as he knew she was pregnant, so that would have been a few weeks later, maybe 8 weeks later, he decided he couldn't stand her anymore. He loved Lady Jersey, his mistress. He'd done what he'd been asked to do by Parliament. He got her with child, and that was that. They never lived together again, except for one brief moment when it appeared they were reconciled, but it was a mirage. He bought her, gave her a house at Montague House in Blackheath, well away from London. His daughter had her own establishment as the heir to the throne, and she was only allowed to see her, Caroline was only allowed to see her baby once a week. It's very sad. His awful treatment as his wife was key to the unpopularity that he suffered when he became, well, even before he became regent, he's still Prince of Wales, but certainly when he was regent and later king, he was already established in the public's mind as a very unpleasant character that had abandoned his wife, that he was a really unkind, unpleasant person. The public obviously didn't know the background, they didn't know the circumstances, they just saw him as a horrible person who had lots of mistresses, was totally unfaithful to all the women that he knew and claimed to be so passionately fond of, and that he'd abandoned his wife, and they didn't know why. She became, and so Caroline, sort of in her absence, became very popular with the British public. She became a sort of star character because they didn't know any circumstances, they didn't know what had happened, they didn't know that she was inappropriate as a consort for somebody that was the first gentleman of Europe. They took her to their hearts, and they took the princess to their hearts. In case you're wondering, I mean, this is going way ahead. In case you're wondering what happened to Princess Charlotte, who was the heir to the throne for years and years and years, because they never had any more children. And she was popular as she grew up, and people, the public were able to see her as she went out into society, began to undertake some public engagements as the future heir to as the heir to the throne, future queen. Married young, married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Prince Albert's uncle, and uncle to Queen Victoria, Uncle Leopold. And she had one miscarriage and then got pregnant and died following childbirth. The baby was born dead. Great tragedy. The baby was fully formed, a beautiful baby, stillbirth. So a little boy, a boy. Her little boy was born dead, and a few hours later she hemorrhaged and died, and that's how we ended up with Queen Victoria. So we will come to that later. So one good thing about George, but not because of anything he did, but just because of circumstances, he was totally uninterested in politics, and like his father, he didn't interfere, or very, very rarely interfered in politics. So that meant that we now, at that point, developed the form of parliamentary government that we're used to today, a two-party system, a party in government, a party in opposition, with party policies, with agendas, party manifestos, party programs, so that you could tell one political group from another, which had always been very difficult before. You know, Whigs and Tories just been kind of not really knowing what they stood for, and politics being so confusing in the reign of George III. Politics suddenly become more interesting, more modern, and could actually, because the king was royal family no longer interfering in politics, and George IV didn't. it's the beginning of modern government. And we look at what the governments were doing rather than what the royal family were doing. So that's what we'll do next. We will do George IV as regent, what happened during his regency. And then we'll move on to George IV as king. He was only king for 10 years, 1820 to 1830. But that's what we'll do. Next week, we'll do the regency.
No, week after next.
Week after next, sorry, I keep saying next week. Yeah, week after next meeting, we will do what happened during the regency. It's a very interesting period. Thank you for listening. Oh, ow.
Andy.
Judy.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy. Very good today. Very good.
Yes, thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you, Judy.
I do sometimes forget to thank Judy. There's no doubt about the amount of effort it takes to get the notes together, and it's a real joy. Peter, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, technical side. The algorithm that's sort of trying to focus on Judy today, it seemed particularly distracting. I don't know if other people found this. As Judy moved, then it picked up the back of the chair, and then that disappeared at other times. I don't know whether it's the position of the camera, or maybe we could manage without that algorithm. Have you got a plain background at home somewhere?
You want to see my mucky office, Peter? That's what it is. You want to
Can't
see
be worse than mine.
idea. No, thank you, Pete. That's a helpful comment. Thank you very much indeed. I shall be posting this recording up on the YouTube a bit later. And just to repeat, the week after next, which will be the 20th, won't it? 6 and 4, yeah, it'll be the 20th, I think.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, folks. Thank you for supporting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, take off the recording, Martin.
I shall do that, yes.